Thank you very much, Lucy, and thank you very much for having me along. Just before I started, I was trying to read the messages that were pouring in on the chat box, and I'm terribly excited because people coming in from everywhere. It started off with lots of people from Mexico, then we had Romania and Argentina and Vietnam, and I haven't quite seen where everyone else is coming from. Because I can't see the chat box at the moment, but that's another story. Anyway, hello, everyone. Yes, this is Jeremy Harmer speaking, and I'm speaking to you from Cambridge in the United Kingdom. For me, it's 4:02 in the afternoon. Thank you for getting up early, if you got up early, or whatever time it is with you. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever it is where you are. And we're going to, I've got a talk for you, and I've called it, when I can get to it, I've called it The Enigma of Language. And I want to start by showing you these three pictures and just have a look at them and see if they mean anything to you. One of the people is real. I mean, they're all real, obviously, but one of the people is real, and the other two are actors. I wonder if you can tell which is which. And while you're thinking about it, I'll put you out of your misery probably, and say that the guy lying down on the left is an actor, and the boy with the dog is an actor. But the girl in the middle is not an actor. She's for real. What links them together, these three? I'll tell you. On the left is an actor portraying a 19th century figure from Germany called Caspar Hauser. And Caspar Hauser was found as an adolescent in the woods. He seemed to be abandoned. He couldn't speak. He had no language. And it transpired, at least that's what we think, it transpired that he had never engaged in conversation. He'd never lived with people. And therefore, he'd never acquired a language to speak. And the records say that he was gradually helped and taught how to speak as an adult, though it was pretty difficult because we all expect that we're going to learn languages as babies and as young kids. The actor on the right is portraying someone called, from, again, the 19th century, from France, called Victor Aveyron. And he was a feral child found in the woods, apparently had never seen a human before and had lived with animals. And he was sort of filthy and feral and sort of animal-like. And he is historically accurate. He was taken in by a doctor called Iturbe and in France, and the doctor and his housekeeper tried to educate this boy and help him to get language and to become civilized and things like that. And they had some success, but not a huge amount. Now, my problem at the moment is I can't see the chat box. People are still coming in. Maybe I can. Let's see if I can find it. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The girl in the middle is real. And this was a picture taken in the 20th century when she was young. And she's called Jeannie Wiley, and she's very famous. People have written books about her. Many people have gathered around her, trying to help her. As far as we know, because the state of California won't tell anyone anything about her, but as far as we know, she's still alive. Now, Jeannie Wiley, her name is, although Jeannie apparently isn't really her name. Um, I don't want to ruin the talk by getting all depressed, but Jeannie Wiley was brought up by a terribly cruel and ridiculously crazy father, and who didn't allow her to speak, and visited a whole lot of other cruelties on her as a kid. So when she was found, and she was only ever discovered because her mother went to the wrong place with her, walked into an office. The mother wanted the mother herself to be seen by a doctor, but she walked into the wrong office, and that's how this girl was discovered. And it's a rather depressing. Well, of course, it's a depressing story because she was uh, taken in by the social services and by the care services, but they all seemed to have messed it up really badly. And there was one woman who got close to her and wrote a whole book about her, but the state of California won't let this woman see her anymore, blah, 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 blah. Why am I showing you these three people? I'll tell you why. Because they remind us of this extraordinary thing that happens to all of us, that happened to you, that happened to me, which is that I didn't choose. Well, I didn't choose to be born. If it comes to that, I'm quite pleased I was. But I didn't choose to learn a language, to get a language, to have a language. It just kind of happened. It happened through a whole process of being raised, being brought up, being cared for by my mother and by my father, and they talked to me. And as they talked to me, and made sense of the world around me. And as I started as a sort of few months old, and then a few more months old, to kind of to have some needs and all this kind of thing, I gradually started to pick up bits of language, and there we are. And the result of that is that I speak pretty good English, really, just as judging from what I could see from the people I could see on the chat box. If only I could get it back. There are people in this session who grew up presumably with very little trouble and no particular volition as kids. They grew up speaking Spanish or Romanian or Vietnamese or whatever, or any other language that happens to be their own language. Because one of the great miracles of human existence is that we end up speaking, using pretty almost all of us, though depending on if you have any kind of mental problem, sort of developmental problems or something, or brain damage or anything, pretty much all of us speak a language. The question then is, what is our language? What language do we actually speak? Well, we speak a mother tongue. That's the language in the home. And presumably it's called a mother tongue because originally it was used to describe the language that the mother spoke to their child. But of course, it might not be the mother's language. That's not necessarily the language that is the main language of the home. So there's a home language, and that might be different from the mother tongue. In other words, if there are two parents in a house and one of them speaks one language and one speaks the other, the dominant language in the family might not be the mother's language. So home language seems better. Or does it? What about the term native language? Well, native language, I suppose, is the language of the people of the community you're in. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's your language, the one you spoke in your home. It gets very, very confusing, and we could spend hours trying to work out what. Oh, and then there's first language as well. What's your first language? And maybe your home language isn't actually your first language. You get the point. You get the point. It's a complicated business, but pretty much all of us, without too much effort, start out after a few years speaking a language. And it might be the language in the home, and it might be the language in the country or the society or the community or something like that. I only discovered recently, I don't know whether you know this, that February the 21st is the International Day of the Mother Language. Are these called the International Day of the Mother Language? Dia Internacional de la Madre. I don't know what it is. At any rate, but there is actually a day from the United Nations which celebrates the mother tongue, the fact that all of us come from somewhere, and that somewhere is what gives us language. And I didn't know that. I mean, I'm just rather interested in that. I thought you might be interested to know what are the main languages in the world as it happens. Well, here's a little graphic from World Languages, and it's interesting, isn't it? If you think, I'm looking here now, English seems to have about 335 million speakers of it as a native language, as a sort of main language of commerce and things like that. I was surprised to see that Spanish actually beats English by quite a lot. That's got 399 however many billion or something, or million speakers. I don't know how many it is. And it's quite a nice graphic, because as you can see which countries speak Spanish, and so Spain's got about 34 million, and Mexico's got 103 something. Right. Anyway, you get the point. Chinese is a massive number one language. Portuguese, if you're from Brazil down there, or from Portugal, yeah, those are the main languages. The sort of dominant languages of the world. Of course, there's been a lot of work done in trying to predict how that's going to pan out in the next 100 years, next 200 years. If you were to do this graphic in 200 or 300 years, would it look the same? Would any of these languages have shrunk and disappeared? Or I don't know. It'd be interesting, wouldn't it? But of course, the idea that because in England, English is the main language, it's the only language spoken in England, is ridiculous. Just as is the idea that because Spanish is the main language of Mexico, which I think is the most populous Spanish-speaking country in the world, that everyone in Mexico speaks Spanish, or everyone in Mexico speaks Spanish only. It's not true. Actually, many countries are incredibly linguistically diverse. And here's a list of the top 10 countries of the number of languages spoken in the country by their populations. You'll see there Mexico's number 8 with 292 million, 292 different languages, and so on, extant languages around the country. Of course, India's got 456 languages spoken dotted around that huge country. China's got 309 kind of indigenous languages, languages spoken by different communities. It's absolutely fantastic. The one that just blows your mind there, of course, is that Papua New Guinea, with its little population of 8.8 million people, they've got more languages, more different indigenous languages spoken in Papua New Guinea, this tiny place, than, as it says in that graphic, the whole of Europe put together. That's just, I just keep looking at that and thinking, can that be true? But I think it is true. So there we are. Now, you get an extraordinary situation then in countries like Nigeria, number 3 on the list, where kids regularly grow up speaking as first languages, home language. See, that's the problem. We get into terrible trouble here. regularly speaking about 4 or 5 languages. Uh, Kids grow up bilingual and so on and so forth. In your country, wherever you're from, it may be the case now that it's becoming increasingly common that you get families like this. This is a family living in Britain, and you've got Riccardo there. That's the guy with the white T-shirt, and he's Italian. And his wife is Gwen, and she's from the Netherlands, from Holland. So the boy, Bart, that's a little boy, he gets a regular diet of at least 2 languages. He gets Italian from his dad, and Dutch from his mum, and English from the streets. And the dog just gets, well, noise, I suppose. I don't know what the dog gets. And that's a typical kind of a modern family, isn't it? Where you have people, I suppose, 200 years ago, most people married people from their communities and so on and so forth. But now, with the kind of world we have, people are frequently married to people who grew up with a different language. And so the question then is, what languages do the kids speak? And that's why we talked before about the problem about saying what a mother tongue is and what a home language is and what a first language is and a second language. If you are part of a bilingual family, can you say which is the first language and which is the second language? And if you were to ask your children, if you have children, what would they say? And if you look, then here's a little graph which is quite good fun. In the UK, which of course is compared to South America or Latin America's tiny little place, the UK. But if you look at the UK, it looks like if you're young, about 40% of you are probably multilingual. They might have more than 2 languages, so English and maybe 2 home languages or something like that. It's interesting, isn't it? But this may reflect the way the world has changed. It's interesting that percentage drops dramatically the older people get. Or no, that's rubbish. The older people are right now, the less of them are likely to be multilingual. But of course, since then, since these people were born, the 55 plus people, my age group, were born, the world has changed dramatically. Much more movement of people across borders and much more immigration and so on and so forth. Well, you may wonder why we're having this conversation, why I'm telling you all about this. Because I wanted to start. By the way, I don't know whether you know this, but immigrant families, they often talk about the rule of 3, that if you have parents who are bilingual, sometimes one of those languages disappears in 3 generations. And you have this terrible thing, which always makes me want to cry, where you have immigrant grandmothers who can't really speak to their grandchildren because they don't have a language in common. That's neither here nor there. Why have I spent hours talking about this? Well, as this talk goes on, I think you'll see. But the first conclusion we can draw is that everyone, unless they have learning difficulties, brain damage, or some other psychological impediment, has the ability to learn or acquire a second language. So as their first language. And most people, everyone has the ability to learn or acquire a second language. But some are more successful than others. How good are you at learning a second language? Well, I'm guessing that you're pretty good. Those of you who don't have English as a first language or a home language or a mother or whatever it is. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. I thought I'd get personal, and because I want to draw some things out of this and see where we go. So if you don't mind, I'm going to be terribly personal and tell you about me. Me. So I want to tell you about me. I think I'm fairly typical. now in the world. So I speak English. I speak good English. Well, no, it's not good English. It's just English. Why do I do that? Because it was my mother tongue. Because as I said before, I grew up with English around me, and it didn't cost me any effort to learn how to speak it. And there's still quite a high percentage of my country, men and women, who only have that language. A smaller percentage than we had before, say 100 years ago, 200 years ago, but there's still people who only speak one language. In my case, it's not my only language. When I went to school, I learned French. And it's quite interesting, this. You've got to be very careful talking stories about individual people. You can't make policy on the basis of an individual person. But the reason I'm telling you all this is just to sort of draw out some things which we'll be talking about in a minute. I started studying French at school when I was about 13, and I got on pretty well with it, to be honest. It was all grammar translation in those days, because I'm about 100 years old, tremendous sort of grammar translation. I did well. Other people in my class, my contemporaries, when we were young teenagers, didn't do so well because maybe it didn't quite fit them. But, we were translating things like the pen of my aunt is smaller than the garden of my uncle, and sentences like that. La plume de ma tante est plus grande que le jardin de mon oncle. Rather silly sentences like that. Interestingly enough, and with the complete stupidity of young teenagers, I took my French exam early because I was good at it. And then I gave it up because, well, I've got the exam, so what's the point? Which is so stupid, because the result of that is that I didn't progress very much. Although 2 years later, no, 2 or 3 years later, I went to work, did some casual labor in the grape harvest in France. And for the first week, I couldn't say anything, but the second week I was speaking very fluently. So it looked as if, for me, grammar translation had really worked. And if I'd only stayed in contact with French, I'd probably be a pretty good speaker of French right now. My problem is, of course, that I came into contact with this. I went and lived in my early 20s in Mexico for quite a few years. And as a result, I got Spanish, as I acquired Spanish, so my French was kind of pushed out of the way because I didn't have much opportunity to speak it. Why did I learn Spanish? Well, it's not exactly like learning your first language. Well, but because if you're going to live in Mexico or Ecuador or Argentina or somewhere like that, you got two options. One is to just sort of stay inside, just talking to people who speak English, and the other is to actually engage with the society around you. And if you do that, you end up speaking Spanish rather whether you want to or not. Indeed, one of us who's here, and she knows exactly who I'm talking about, arrived in the Spanish-speaking country rather like me, with no Spanish at all, and was plunged into it in really a very, very difficult way. And you basically, it's survival, and then you learn the language because it's all around you. And if you want, if you want to interact, well, you get it. So, I mean, my Spanish isn't perfect. Luckily, thanks to the Common European Framework of Languages, I know how good my Spanish is because I've never taken an exam or a class, but I can reckon that I'm about C1. Occasionally I go up to C2, and sometimes in the wrong topic and situation, I kind of plunge back down a bit. But that's what it's like. There we are. Now, this is the last personal thing I'm going to tell you about me. But I happen to be married to a Brazilian wife. And so, of course, the language I really want to speak is Portuguese. But the problem is, my wife and I have only ever talked to each other in English, and I've never needed Portuguese when I'm with her. And the result is I haven't got round to learning Portuguese. It's driving me absolutely nuts. Why? Well, it's something to do with a psychological issue I've got, or a motivational issue, or something like that. I'll go back to what I was saying about Spanish. I didn't even have to be motivated to learn Spanish. I just kind of did because there I was. Portuguese, I don't need it, but it would be really nice if I could, but I just haven't got round to it. I've got one last story, which is a little bit about me, but it's actually my eldest daughter, and she was born in Mexico, and so she grew up bilingually. And she's an example of everything I was talking about. Her home language was well, it was with her mother and father, it was English, but with anyone else in the house, it was Spanish. So by the age of 4.5, she was, to all intents and purposes, completely bilingual. And then we moved back to the UK, and she lost her Spanish like that, aggressively, because she couldn't see the need for it, because no one around her was speaking Spanish. So she lost it. And that fascinates me too. And I couldn't believe it. I said, well, we'd better start speaking Spanish because to keep her Spanish up. But it was clear that unlike the Italian and the Dutch woman I showed you the picture of, we didn't have a pattern of speaking to her in Spanish. So the young 4.5-year-old absolutely rejected it, and that was that. Now, what I'd like to do with all of you, if only we were face to face, and I could, is I'd like to say, could you draw a diagram like this and describe all the different languages you speak, and what your story was, the successful ones and the not so successful ones? And why on earth have I spent so much time on this? Well, because in your classrooms in front of you, you got all these students. And I think these little stories lead me to 4 conclusions. Number 1, if you want something bad enough, or you need something bad enough, or if you're in the right place, luckily enough, you've got all the elements necessary for successful language learning. It seems to me those are absolutely critical, the wanting and the needing. If you don't need it, if you don't need a second language, it's much more difficult to have the psychological equipment necessary to learn it. Of course, you might want it because you want to pass an exam, or because you want to please your teacher, or because you just want to do well at school. That's possible. If you're learning a second language like English, and you happen to be able to live in an English-speaking community where you needed English, you'd almost certainly learn it. But in the classroom, we know very well, because we all teach, we know very well that some people in our class do learn it, and some people don't so much. It seems to be, if you look at theories of child language acquisition, even for the first language, you know, the home language, the mother tongue, whatever you like, that language becomes more and more part of your system if it's involved with social engagement. That's the engagement you have with your mother and your father and all that kind of thing. And if you personally take charge of it, and that's what kids do, after all, they start wanting to say things. And everything that happens to a kid's language in a functioning family at the beginning is all about social engagement, talking and interacting with people. We also know that one of the key components for successful language learning is about that agency, which is, in other words, my control of what's happening to me, as opposed to being passive. But it's also to do with conscious processing, that what I do is to process the information in front of me and sort it out in my brain to work out how it works. Language learning seems to be a constant sort of battle of forming of hypothesis, trying it out, and so on and so forth. And I put conscious in brackets because because sometimes it's very conscious, you're thinking about it. Other times it seems to happen subconsciously. Right, I better move on. I've been talking for too long. But the critical thing, of course, is that what we know absolutely about language teaching is one size doesn't fit all. Let me take you back to what I said about my French learning, which was that I did pretty well on that. No particular I'm not saying how wonderful I am. I just did. It just seemed to suit me. But lots of other kids, boys in my class, didn't do very well because grammar translation probably wasn't right for them. It didn't suit their kind of mindset or something like that. Right. There we are. So let's put all of that into practice. That long introduction. Let's put it into practice. I want to get you to want or to need or to be in the right place for language. I want you to need something. I want you to want something. Right. Look at that. And now look at this. And now look at that. And now look at that. Now, I would be really upset if I thought that your interest hadn't been piqued a little bit. I'd be really upset if I thought you just looked at those and gone, yeah, I don't care. What I hope is you look at all these and you go, oh, what's that? That I wonder what that is. Oh, that? What the hell's going on there? What's going on? Now, as it happens, all of these pictures come from a coursebook unit. It's a coursebook unit about, guess what? It's a coursebook unit about art. But very quickly, they've got little interesting stories attached to them. That one is in the United Kingdom. It's on a beach. It's a sculpture to honor one of our great classical musical composers, but it caused huge controversy because the residents of that town didn't want it, and they sprayed it with graffiti and they tried to get it removed and so on and so forth. The second one is a prize-winning work by an artist from Thailand, and I've forgotten her name for a second. And it's all about memory, about losing memory, a girl losing her memory. The third one is really good fun. This was a massive Canadian hoax in which a national radio station started reporting on this Canadian artist no one had ever heard of, and she was doing exhibitions of art where the walls were bare. There was nothing on them. And a case was made that this was what art should be. You engage with your inner self, blah, blah. And of course, it turned out it was all a complete hoax. This artist, Laura Newstrom, she was supposedly called, but it turns out the radio people have been hoaxed. This artist never existed, and this never existed, and so on and so forth. And the last one is this is a photograph I took just by Central Park in New York of an artwork by an Italian artist, and the plane, you can't see it in the picture, but the plane just continued rotating round and round and round, and it was kind of mesmerizing. And now, why am I showing you this? Well, because what I hope I've done is I've created the need or the want in you to find out more about these things, and the only way you can find out about them is through the texts and the information and all this other kind of stuff that's there in English. So what we hope we do is we drag students. Yeah, that's unfair. We encourage students to want the language they need to process these images and find out more about them. And that we've been doing this for generations. For as long as I've been in language teaching, we try and find things that will stimulate students' engagement and curiosity, because that'll lead them to the language. We might do something like this. We might say, right, I want you to get into small groups. and in quarter of an hour, you're going to have to present to the rest of the class a talk on the value for the visual arts. Is the real or is it real or is it imagined? What is the value of the visual arts in society? And you're going to have to work together, and then you're going to have to present it in English. You can use anything you want. You can use the internet, you can use books, you can use anything. But I'm hoping that because you're going to have to stand up in front of the class and present it, and because every single person in the group will be responsible for how well you present it, then you need the language. You're going to have to get the language, and so on and so forth. So there's some ideas of what I mean by wanting and needing. Being in the right place, that's more complicated. If you're in a secondary school class in Guayaquil, or a secondary school class in Ho Chi Minh City, or in Cluj or Yash or somewhere, to think of some of the countries that I saw before I started this talk. That's more difficult. To be in the right place, isn't it? It leads us to an interesting situation. I visited a few years ago the primary school attached to the Middle East Turkish University in Ankara, and in that primary school, in the English department, the only language that is allowed is English. So that one of the teachers told me that when she was at a parents' evening and she talked to the parents of this kid, the kid couldn't believe it because she was talking Turkish. She was Turkish after all, but the kid had never known she could actually talk Turkish because they lived in English. Anyway, you get the point. If I can create the conditions for you to really want the language, or need it, then there's a good chance you'll go for it. There's a better than average chance that you'll go for it. And in Jetstream, which is the course that Helbling has, thank you Helbling, published, that I've had the great good fortune of being involved in. We spend a lot of time trying to create situations where people need or want to speak. And so classically, we've got a situation which my wonderful co-author, Jane Ravel, this is a big thing of hers, which I instantly picked up and sort of latched onto when she and I first started working together. She calls it everybody up. And the idea is everyone gets into the middle of the class, and then you talk to each other to answer these questions in a group, not in pairs, by the way, in a group. It's very important it happens in a group. And the only way you can find this information and deal with it is by speaking English. And you do it in all sorts of ways you can, and so on and so forth. So that's some short, small examples of wanting and needing and being in the right place. This one, by the way, has tremendous kind of agency, the kind of social and personal, social engagement, a kind of personal contact that we want. In other words, the involvement of the student's heart, not just their mind, and so on and so forth. So let's go on to that. Here's a question for you. I'd like you to talk to the person next to you, or maybe in little groups of 3 or something. Do you find it difficult learning a foreign language? Why? Why not? How many did you speak? What's it like for you learning a foreign language? What's your story? A bit like I did with you earlier on. Why am I asking you to talk about that? Well, because I need you to be here with me in the classroom or on the screen, present and emotionally present, sort of completely emotionally present, so that when I show you the text I'm going to show you and ask you to read it, you already kind of want it and need it a little bit, but much more to the point, you bring yourself to the task of reading the text. Here's the text, and it's called The Enigma of Language. That's why this talk is called The Enigma of Language. And there are the people we talked about. Now, of course, those 3 pictures show you films there's the Wim Wenders film in the middle. That's it. Oh, there may all be the Truffaut film. But this is a text about the enigma of language, and it's about the sort of things we've been talking about. This is from Jetstream Upper Intermediate, as it happens, the new edition. We've got a new edition out. And it tries to sort of discuss at an appropriate language for the students the sort of issues we've been talking about. And it ends with, it says, questions. What do you think? What's the best way to learn a foreign language? Now, I've got you in the mood by talking about how difficult you find it to learn a language and talking about how you learn languages and what's going on and blah, blah, blah. I've now got you to read a text, and reading a text can be quite a dry business in a classroom or online or whatever it is. But for me, it only comes alive. A text only comes alive. It doesn't come alive when you say, ask comprehension questions and all that kind of thing, although they may be really useful. It comes alive when I say, ask you this question. What's your reaction to the information in the text? How would you answer the last question? Because the moment you do that, I'm saying, this is all about you. This is all about you, dear student. This is about you. I'm not, in a way, you understand what I mean. This isn't quite true. I'm not that interested in what your neighbor thinks or what the person in the row behind you thinks, if you're sitting in rows. What interests me is how do you respond to what you've read? What's your emotional response to this? Whatever it is. Because if I can get you to demonstrate your emotional response, it means you're there. It means you're there in the text, in the classroom, with me. And that seems to me to be absolutely critical, because everything I said about learning languages at the beginning and about the conditions for learning languages, we need anybody learning a second language has to be there, has to be emotionally there. So that's sort of an example of what I was talking about. Let's talk about processing. It's of course possible that one way to get students to process language is to teach them grammar like I was taught when I was a kid, like I was taught French. Translate from French into English, translate from English into French, say the parts of the French verb, put adjectives and nouns together and make sure you get the gender right and all this kind of stuff. That suits some people very well, but not necessarily other people. Nevertheless, we need students to understand how the system works or to get some knowledge, conscious or subconscious, of how the system works. So I wonder if we can go about it different ways. One of the greatest, well, let's see. Here's a picture. Again, it's from the upper intermediate level of Jetstream. This is a picture, and I'll have to take you through it fairly quickly. I've just looked at the time as it's going past. But you'll see there's something rather extraordinary about this picture, because those four guys all look pretty much the same. And they don't just look the same, they're dressed the same. And in some cases, they have exactly the same hairstyle, like big long ponytails and stuff like that. And then there's a young woman and then an older woman. And I would ask you, and you can sort of pick up some clues, because it's and somebody, yes, you can pick up some clues about these boys from the backdrop behind them. And I then say, okay, I get all of them to read this text. By the way, if you've seen this before, if you've used the book before, I do apologize, but I hope in a minute you'll understand why I'm taking us through. So very, very quickly, all of the students read this paragraph. It's about a boy called Mukunda, and he opens the door of his apartment where he lives in New York with his 5 brothers and 1 sister and walks out. He's the first of his siblings to ever go outside. Mukunda, the name his father has chosen for him, means bringer of freedom. Mukunda goes down the stairs and out into the street. He walks into a bank and grocery store. He's wearing a scary mask from one of his favorite horror movies. And that's the startup paragraph. And everyone kind of goes, what the hell? Well, you hope they do. So we're creating interest and a need. Then a classically familiar technique of teaching, you put students in 5 different groups. Each group gets a different paragraph. So this says one day, this is about Crystal Moselle, who bumped into these kids on the streets of New York. She'd never seen them before. And when and one of them talked to her and they said, what do you do? And he said, she makes movies. And the boy said, so do they. Another paragraph, which only the group with the paragraph can see, the others can't see it, is about Oscar Angulo. And he met Suzanne, and they were backpacking through Peru in 1989. They fell in love. Oscar was part of a religious sect, and they had all these children, 7 children, 6 boys and a girl, and they had all these Sanskrit names from India, Bhagavan, Govinda, and Narayana, and Mukunda, and Krishna, and Jagadisa, and Vishnu for the girl. And it says, perhaps because of what happened, some of the boys have changed their names. Another group has this paragraph, that Oscar was described as work shy, and he believed the world was a dangerous place that his children shouldn't have to experience. He kept them this is quite extraordinary. He kept them confined in their Lower East Side apartment in New York City. They hardly ever left their home. The neighbors didn't even know they existed, and they were just on the other side of the wall. Isn't that incredible? And the only money they got was from the welfare checks and the money that Suzanne, the mother, earned as a homeschool teacher. But the thing which makes them so special is that the one thing their dad did do is he bought them, in those days, hundreds, thousands of movies on DVDs. And that's how the boys learned how the world was. And then they would laboriously write the scripts of the movies they saw and then make their own versions of them. It's just beyond belief, actually. Do you remember the boy at the beginning? They arrested him because of his scary mask. He wouldn't talk, but they took him to a psychiatric hospital. He loved it because he hadn't actually interacted with people except for his brothers. And then this tells you the whole point of this story, which is Crystal, that young filmmaker, became friends with him, and she spent 2 years with him, gradually filming them and so on and so forth. And it turned it into a documentary called The Wolf Pack, and it won an award at the Sundance Film Festival. Now, if you've seen this before, apologies, but the point I want to make is this. One way of getting students to process is not to say, you're learning, you're learning, you're learning. But this jigsaw reading really works, because the only way to make it work is you're sitting there in a group, you have your paragraph, you have to read it and understand it, so that then when you mix with someone who's read another paragraph and a person who's read the other paragraph, and you all share it, you can make head or tail of what the story is all about. It's a classic technique. It's almost like learning without trying, in the sense that I haven't yet said to you, you must learn this, you must learn that. I've said, fight this language and then interact with each other and construct the story. And then here we go. I want you to remember it without me sort of, before I get into grammar or any of that stuff, because it's language we're talking about, it's communication, is right. Put all your paragraphs away. You've told the story to each other. You more or less understood it. Who can tell me the story from memory? Then the other students listen and they correct it. And you keep doing that for a bit until the story is told and retold. Language is repeated again and again. And all the time when students are trying to retell the story, their brains are processing the language that they've been dealing with. It's sort of effortless language learning. Of course, it's not effortlessness. They're effortless. They have to think. Here's something else, which is really important to me and Jane in particular, which is what we call takeaway language, or as you can see from the graphic, suitcase language. which words or phrases from this story that you've just read, all those, because of course now they can look at all the paragraphs, do you most want to be able to use? Choose 2 or 3 words or phrases that you want to be able to use, that you want to be able to put in your suitcase and take away with you. Make them your words. And we're saying, this is about you. You're the learner. It's what you do with the language. I'm trying to say with this tiny little exercise, I'm giving you agency. I'm giving you agency. I'm giving you control over what's going on. So this is all about processing. And it's social and personal as well, because I'm saying you interact, you as a person, please, 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 it's you. And then I can also say, right, off you go onto the internet, find out as much as you can about these boys and about the wolf pack. Just find out as much as you can. And again, it's about you, but you have to process language, because unless you can get all this information in Spanish or Vietnamese or Romanian or Greek or whatever language it is, then you're going to have to read about it in English. Effortless language learning. Wow. Isn't that fantastic? Of course, we've got this as well. So look at this text, all the different paragraphs. You've got present simple, present continuous, present perfect, and you have to do this kind of thinking exercise with the grammar, and then you go back to the text and you find examples of each tense in A to F, and you make sure with your partner that you agree, and so on. And that's a sort of consciousness raising. Remember, this is upper intermediate, so hopefully they've got some of this language consciousness raising thing they can do. You can do all sorts of things. Any piece of text, any piece of English they come across, you can do things. You could say, look, here's one of the paragraphs. I could say to you, okay, I'm going to give you sentences, and you have to put bits of sentences together to recreate sentences from the text. And in order to do this, it's not that difficult, but you do have to think. And it does force you to really concentrate on the language, really concentrate on the language. So if you look at A, you have to go A plus B plus C makes a sentence. So in A, you've got amazingly. What's the next one, do you think? Amazingly, I'm going to go with amazingly A, B. Many of their neighbors, B, C, didn't even know they existed. Gosh, we got a sentence from that paragraph. Or next one, he kept them confined from the movies. No, their welfare checks. Oh no, he kept them confined in their Lower East Side apartment. Oh, there we are, in New York City. Now, the point is, what you see what I'm doing. It's not difficult. You have to concentrate, and as you're concentrating, you're processing language, and hopefully the magic is working for you. The whole sort of gear you've got, the whole kind of technical gear you've got in your brain works. You could do all sorts of other things. I could say, see how many. I shouldn't have shown you the. I could say, find some past participles in the text. How many can you find, and what are they for? And can you make sentences in the same kind of way? So we've got Oscar Angelo brackets described by Summers Workshire brackets believed, or he kept them confined, which is not so much a past participle, but that's neither here. And then at the bottom, she herself also trapped. Anything you want in this one paragraph, you can study. You can get them to identify pronunciation elements, spelling elements, and so on and so forth. I could get you just to identify all the past tenses and see if they're all the same, and separate them into categories, and then maybe use these sentences use these words in your own sentences. On and on and on. We can do so much stuff like that. the point is, if we can get students to really process language, but make it a bit of a challenge and fun and give them some agency and hopefully get them to do it in kind of through social engagement or something like that, there's a good chance that the language learning will happen in a more, what's the word, organic way than just sort of hitting them with grammar and fill-ins and stuff like that. But now that I say that, I have to think carefully, don't I? Because I did very well with grammar and things like that when I was a kid. It's a bit of a problem, really. The whole thing is that one size does not fit all. So the point I've been trying to make in this is that on the kind of macro level, as language learners, we're all we have our individual stories to tell, and we do it all in a different way. And so if you're designing material for people, you need to try and provide things for a whole range of different students. And if you look at our course, Jetstream, you'll find all of these little hints and elements. You've got memory. We talked about that. Can you remember the story? We've got your response. How you first? How did you respond to the text? We've got everybody up. We talked about that. We've got getting students to explore on the internet, explore more about what they. We've got takeaway language, which is saying you choose what you want to take away because this is your show, my dear student, not mine. We've got an element which I haven't talked about, your story, where you get students to tell their stories of similar things. And there's speaking, grammar, vocabulary, speaking and writing, and so on. Oh, and lastly, because this really is useful for some people, we've got cyber homework. You can go off and sort of play around with that. Now, I'm going to stop there because our time is up anyway, and because I've reached the end of what I wanted to say.